The first candidate was named Paul. If we stick to a purely mathematical calculation, we could say that Paul S., we will omit his last name to protect his memory, held the position of secretary to Mr. White for 13 hours. A few hours less if we subtract the time he spent sleeping without knowing he had been chosen. Unlike the rest of the people who showed up at the old man's house, Paul S. sent the job application like someone who buys a lottery ticket, with great hope, but with slight odds of being rewarded. Although in this case, good luck or very bad luck, depending on how you look at it, led to his being chosen. When he heard the news, still half asleep and in his pajamas, he went out to the balcony of his house and, raising his voice, shouted to the four winds, "Who's the moron now, world? Huh?" An exclamation that was heard all over the neighborhood, but which no one responded to. He embraced his wife and son. They regarded him proudly, eyes moist from crying, and with that special spark in the pupils that belies unchecked greed.
"How long do you think it'll take him to kick the bucket, honey?"
"I don't know, dear."
"You gonna charge a lot, Dad?"
"I don't know, son." Paul S. tried not to have high hopes. It wasn't good to get carried away by euphoria. The only thing he thought about was getting dressed and taking the train that would deliver him to the old buzzard's house. He said goodbye to his family, who showered him with displays of pride and admiration, and he set off with suitcase in hand, his only luggage, toward his enigmatic future. Paul kept a level head until he reached the station. The train he had to board had not yet arrived, and he sauntered about the platform, fending off the feeling of success that was about to go to his head. Calculating, he weighed the pros and cons of the situation. Putting up with a geezer, he said to himself, is not an easy task. All of them, at the end of their lives, become children again, capricious, selfish, dependent. And Mr. White was surely one of those. If I am to avoid this, I'd better do my job as best as I can, and the rest of the time, smile, agree with him, and praise whatever enters the old man's mind. After all, I'm going to be his secretary, not his nurse. But what if he ended up becoming his nurse? Mr. White, from what he knew, lived alone, and if he ever needed his help, he would have no other choice but to oblige. Maybe he would have to go along with him on his strolls, or cook his food, and when his health went downhill, help him dress and undress, and, wash him. He felt a chill, though what irked Paul the most wasn't all that. The worst part was to have to watch over Mr. White during his final hours, following every step of the agony of his body, and being the one to close the old man's eyes when it was all over. A moment that was right around the corner, according to the rumors. However, when Mr. White died, he deduced, those two words in the newspaper, considerable compensation, would come true. As the rest of the aspiring candidates to that position, Paul S. was not at all interested in working. The only thing he wanted was to sink his fangs into Mr. White's money. His face lit up. He drove the old man's wrinkled face out of his mind, which he could only imagine because he had never seen a picture of him, and he thought about the pleasures that the stay in this splendid home would afford him. He imagined it because he did not know what the manor looked like, as one of those dream castles portrayed in tales, 4 or 5 stories high, large towers, Versailles-like lawns, and a plethora of statues on every corner. He was convinced that there was a giant pool on the lawn and that every morning he would swim a few laps before starting his workday. He would meet and shake hands with the most illustrious members of high society who would drop by to see his boss. He would make their acquaintance, and that would serve him to secure his future after the death of his master. Unless he makes me his heir, he thought, ecstatic. Suddenly, he felt a wooziness in his stomach. It was as if the earth had suddenly opened up, and he had fallen into a pit. He noticed a terrible pain in his back. This confused him. A sharp whistle indicated that the train, his train, was coming into the station. He opened his eyes, because until now he had been walking with his eyes closed, and he stared at the ground. He stretched out his hand and touched the gravel that carpeted it.